The village of Raven Hollow was the kind of place that didn't show up on maps. Nestled deep between frost-covered hills, the people who lived there were hardy, proud, and quiet. They survived through the seasons by helping one another, sharing what little they had. But this winter had brought more than cold. It brought silence. A disease had swept through the nearby towns, choking trade routes and closing the only road that led out. Supplies stopped coming. Jobs disappeared. And slowly, so did the food. Eli was just 8 years old. But the things he'd seen would weigh heavily on the heart of any grown man. His mother, Miriam, had once been the village's most joyful voice. Her laughter used to echo across the frozen fields as she hung laundry or told bedtime stories. But now, she lay in bed nearly all day, her cheeks pale, her breath weak. She hadn't eaten in almost 3 days. Eli searched every day. Through snowbanks, abandoned houses, the village church. He wasn't picky, rotten potatoes, stale crackers, anything. But every time, he came back empty-handed. Their kitchen shelves stood bare. The last piece of bread had been eaten 4 days ago, split in half between mother and son. And even then, Miriam had tried to give her share to Eli. It was that night that Eli made a decision. There was no one else to ask. No government phone lines, no charity trucks coming through. The few adults still strong enough to move had already picked through the village's meager remains. So, Eli climbed up on the rickety chair by the old wooden desk. His fingers trembled as he held the pencil. He had never written a letter before, not like this. On a torn piece of paper, he began. Dear God, my name is Eli. I am 8 years old. I live in Raven Hollow with my mom. She is sick, and I think she is going to die. We don't have any food. I looked everywhere. I'm really scared. He paused. His stomach growled, and tears stung his eyes, but he kept going. If you can read this, could you please send us something to eat? I don't need a lot. Just some bread. Or even just something warm for my mom. Please, God. I'm begging you. He folded the letter gently and tucked it into an old envelope he found in a drawer. He didn't know where to send it, but he remembered the stone church at the top of the hill, the one they used to go to before the snow made it too hard to climb. The next morning, before the sun had even risen, Eli bundled himself in every piece of clothing he had. 2 sweaters, a coat 3 sizes too big, a threadbare scarf, and trudged out into the wind. His tiny boots sank deep into the snow with every step. The walk to the church felt endless. His breath fogged the air in front of him, and the cold pierced through his clothes like needles. But he didn't stop. He reached the doors just as the first light broke through the clouds. The church had long since closed. Its heavy wooden doors groaned as he pushed them open. Inside, everything was coated in dust and silence. The pews were empty. The altar was cracked. But in the center stood the old donation box, the one Father Amos used to say was a direct line to heaven. Eli knelt beside it and slid his letter into the slot. He looked up at the ceiling with eyes full of desperation. Please, God, I don't know what else to do. And then, he left. Back at home, Miriam stirred as Eli crawled into bed beside her. She felt like paper beneath the blankets. He told her what he had done, and she smiled weakly, brushing his hair back. You're a good boy, she whispered. And I believe someone heard you. But hours passed. Then a day. Then 2. No one came. No miracle appeared. The candle burned out. The room grew colder. Eli curled up beside his mother, trying to share his body heat, trying not to cry when she stopped whispering his name in her sleep. Then, on the 3rd day, a loud knock shattered the silence. Eli jolted awake. His mother didn't stir. He scrambled to the door, heart racing, barely able to keep his balance from weakness. He opened it with all the strength he had left. Standing outside was a man he had never seen before. He wore a thick coat dusted with snow, boots that looked too new for this village, and he held in his hands something Eli could barely believe. A canvas sack filled to the brim. Bread. Cans. Soup. Crackers. A thermos. The man looked at Eli, then behind him into the dark room. I'm looking for a boy named Eli, he said gently. Is this the right house? Eli nodded, mouth open in shock. I'm Eli. The man knelt down, his voice soft. I found a letter. In an old church. Just a few hills away. I was passing through when I saw it. Something told me to stop and go inside. When I read what you wrote, he paused, his voice catching. I couldn't ignore it. Eli stepped back, tears now streaming freely down his face. The man stepped inside, handing him the bag. Let's get your mom warm. We'll figure the rest out later. That night, the fire crackled once more in the little cottage. Miriam sipped warm broth from a cup, color slowly returning to her cheeks. Eli sat close beside her, holding her hand, still afraid to blink in case it was all a dream. Somehow, a letter written by a starving child had made its way into the hands of a stranger. A stranger who showed up with everything they needed, at the exact moment they needed it. Coincidence? Fate? Or was someone really listening? One thing was certain. Eli's letter had been found. But the story had only just begun. The air inside the cottage was warm again, but not just because of the fire. It was something else, a presence. Eli couldn't describe it, but it was as if the walls that had once closed in with silence were now breathing again. His mother sipped from a mug of broth, weak but awake. A color, however faint, had returned to her cheeks. She looked at the man sitting across from her, her brow furrowed in confusion and awe. I don't understand, she whispered. Who are you? The man gave a soft smile, not unkind, but guarded. Just someone who listens. He didn't offer a name. Not at first. That night, Eli barely slept. He lay under the patched quilt beside his mother, his stomach no longer twisted in knots, but his mind racing. The stranger had unpacked the canvas bag with calm efficiency. Soup, bread, tea, bandages, even a heavy wool blanket. It was more than they'd seen in weeks. Who just found a letter like that? Eli stared at the shadow of the man sitting by the fireplace, hunched slightly forward, his face lit by flickers of orange flame. He hadn't asked for anything. Not food. Not thanks. He had simply come, and stayed. The next morning brought sunlight, the first in what felt like forever. Miriam stirred, asking softly if the man had left. Eli looked over, but the chair was empty. Panic rushed into his chest. But then came the scent. Coffee? He darted into the kitchen and stopped short. The man was at the stove, carefully heating up a can of beans and preparing a tray with toast and tea. It looked so strange. So normal. Like something out of a memory. You're awake, the man said without turning around. Eli nodded. You're still here. I told you I'd stay, he replied, handing him a mug with warm milk. Eli held the mug close, the warmth spreading through his hands like hope itself. What's your name? The man paused, then glanced toward the door. Jonah, he said finally. My name is Jonah. It didn't sound fake. It didn't sound forced. But something about the way he said it. Eli couldn't shake the feeling he was still hiding something. By noon, word had spread. The village wasn't as dead as it seemed. There were still whispers in the wind. Faces behind cracked curtains. Survivors who, like Eli, had almost given up. It started with one knock. Then another. Soon, Jonah stood in the middle of the snow-covered street, speaking with two older women from the neighboring house. He gave them a blanket, a tin of dried fruit. He even repaired their broken heater using tools he carried in a leather pouch. No one saw him arrive. No one saw a truck or horse or sled. And yet, every time someone asked for help, he had what they needed. It didn't take long before people started talking. Eli sat at the window, watching Jonah talk with a young couple holding a baby wrapped in a scarf. He looked like an ordinary man. Not a saint. Not a ghost. But something wasn't adding up. Mom, Eli asked that night as they sat by the fire, how did he find my letter? Miriam didn't answer right away. She was stronger now, her voice steadier, but her eyes still held shadows. There's more to this world than what we see, she said quietly. I don't know how Jonah found you, But I believe something led him. She reached for his hand. And maybe it's because you believed enough to ask. 3 days passed. Jonah didn't leave. Instead, he walked from house to house, often before dawn, returning long after dark. Wherever he went, people whispered. He wasn't just bringing food, he brought small acts of healing. A fixed door, a missing glove returned. Even a lost dog returned to a child who hadn't smiled in weeks. It was as if he knew what was needed before anyone asked. But not everyone was comfortable with his presence. A group of older men from the far side of the village, men who had once served on the village council, gathered in hushed circles, exchanging suspicious glances and shaking heads. "This isn't natural," one of them said. "No man has that much to give without asking something in return." Another added, "People don't just show up with miracles in their pockets." And so, on the 5th night, they went to find him. Eli heard the voices outside. Low, heated, and tense. He peeked out from behind the curtain. Jonah stood in the snow, his coat open despite the cold, his breath steady in the chill. "We want answers," one of the men snapped. "Where are you from? How did you get here? Why now?" Jonah didn't flinch. His voice was calm. "I go where I'm needed." "And who sent you?" another barked. Jonah looked at the stars for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes, I don't even know that myself." There was silence. One of the men stepped forward. "We want you gone. We didn't ask for your help." Jonah's face remained unreadable. But he nodded. "If that's what the village wants, I will go." And with that, he turned and began walking toward the woods. Eli burst through the door, barefoot in the snow. "Wait!" he shouted. Jonah turned slowly. "You can't leave," Eli cried. "You saved us. You saved her." Jonah looked down at the boy, his face softening. "I didn't do anything that wasn't already possible," he said. "I just reminded people how to care again." Eli's eyes burned with tears. "But how did you know? How did you find my letter?" Jonah knelt in front of him. "Your letter wasn't just on paper, Eli. It was in every empty home, every hungry face, every crack in this place's heart." He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Sometimes, the right question reaches the right ears. The next morning, no one could find Jonah. Not in the woods. Not in the hills. But what they found instead was something no one could explain. Food left on doorsteps. Tools neatly stacked by broken barns. A line of firewood outside the church. And on the altar, a note in a familiar hand. "Keep listening. Someone always needs you." No one saw him again. But Raven Hollow was never the same. Because from that day on, the village began to listen. And Eli? He never stopped writing letters. Not because he needed anything, but because he'd learned something more powerful than asking. He'd learned to believe. And then, he was gone. Just like that. The snow fell harder, swallowing his footprints before anyone could follow. The snow began to melt, slowly, like a tired beast retreating back into the mountains. For the first time in months, sunlight warmed the roofs of Raven Hollow. Children emerged from shuttered homes, cheeks pink, voices bright. The smell of fresh bread returned to kitchens, and laughter, once absent, echoed faintly from the lanes. Jonah was gone, but something had stayed behind. The spirit of his presence lingered like smoke after a fire, unseen, but impossible to ignore. Eli became something of a village mystery himself. People spoke his name with a mix of admiration and unease. "The boy who wrote to God," they'd whisper. And someone actually answered. Old Mrs. Harland, who'd barely left her home in years, began leaving loaves of bread for the neighbors every Saturday. Mr. Tobias, the gruff carpenter with a bad leg, offered to fix doors and roofs, free of charge. Even the skeptical councilmen who had driven Jonah away were now holding weekly meetings, not to govern, but to serve. The village was changing. But change, no matter how gentle, always stirs shadows. One morning, weeks after Jonah had vanished, Eli sat beside the fireplace, carefully folding a letter. He didn't write requests anymore. Instead, he wrote stories, dreams, hopes. He would place them into the old church donation box, like always. Sometimes, he imagined Jonah walking through the woods and reading them in the dark. He liked that idea. But someone else had begun to notice the letters. Someone with different intentions. His name was Calder. A tall, narrow man with sharp cheekbones and a voice like cracked ice. He had once lived in Raven Hollow, years ago, before abandoning it for city life. No one expected him to return. But when the village's story made its way into whispers and campfire tales, of a boy, a letter, a miracle, Calder returned. But he did not come with kindness. He came with curiosity and hunger. Not for food, but for power. Calder visited the church one cold evening. The donation box still sat there, worn and silent, the same place where Eli had placed his letter. He pried it open. Inside, dozens of folded notes. Some were simple prayers. Others were thank yous. A few asked for impossible things. Lost loved ones to return, disease to vanish. But none of them had been answered. Except one. Calder picked up Eli's original letter. It had been returned to the church after Jonah disappeared, left carefully atop the altar, as if to say, this is where it began. He read the words slowly, then again, and then he smiled. The next day, Calder began speaking to the villagers. He spoke of patterns, coincidences, divine formulas. He said Jonah was proof that the world could be manipulated, if you just knew how to ask. He didn't come because of kindness, Calder claimed. He came because the boy's letter hit the right frequency. A frequency of desperation, intent, magic. Some believed him. Desperate people will cling to certainty, even if it wears a stranger's face. Calder convinced them to write new letters. But this time, he told them to be specific. Ask for wealth, fame, control. He said God didn't answer unless the stakes were higher. And people listened. The church, once a quiet place of reflection, became crowded. Not with prayers, but with demands. Piles of letters. Some pleading for riches. Others for revenge. Calder read them all. One by one. Every evening, he lit candles and read them aloud, claiming to tune the frequency. His voice echoed through the halls like a chant. Eli watched all of this in silence. He stood outside the church one evening, staring through the broken glass window as Calder paced in front of the altar. This isn't what Jonah meant, he whispered. But no one heard him. Weeks passed. Then strange things began to happen. A barn caught fire under a clear sky. Livestock went missing. Children grew ill again. The warmth that had returned to Raven Hollow began to fade, not because of the cold, but because of fear. Some said the letters had backfired. Others whispered that Jonah had been an angel, and they had driven him away. But Calder told a different story. You didn't ask hard enough, he shouted to the villagers one night. You need to want it more. Sacrifice. Intensity. That's what opens the doors. He demanded offerings. Trinkets. Heirlooms. Even blood. People began to avoid the church. The miracles had stopped. Eli couldn't sleep. The piece Jonah had left behind was unraveling, thread by thread. He thought of writing another letter. But this time, not to ask for help, but to ask for truth. And so, on a night thick with wind and thunder, he climbed the hill again. He entered the church, where candles still flickered, casting long shadows across the pews. Calder was there, hunched over the altar, mumbling words in a language that didn't belong to any prayer Eli knew. You shouldn't be here, Calder said without turning. I came to ask for help, Eli replied, stepping forward. Not from you. Calder stood up, slow and stiff. You think your letter brought him? That faith brought him? No, boy. It was need. Raw, primal need. That's what this place is built on. Eli stared at the donation box. It looked different now. Twisted, darkened, heavy with something wrong. That's not what he said, Eli whispered. Calder laughed. He left. Didn't he? He abandoned you all. And now, I'm the only one listening. Then came the sound. A low hum. The candles flickered. And somewhere deep in the rafters, something moved. Eli didn't run. He stood before the altar and pulled from his pocket a folded piece of paper. His hands shook as he opened it. Dear God, if you can hear me again, we need more than food now. We need to be reminded, not of miracles, but of what's real. Please, bring the truth back. He placed the letter in the box. The hum grew louder. The floor trembled. Calder backed away, eyes wide. What did you do? He hissed. But Eli didn't answer. Because in that moment, the church doors burst open, and a familiar figure stood in the snow. Coat dusted white. Eyes like distant stars. Jonah had returned. The snow outside the church continued to fall, its cold touch creeping through the cracks in the door. But inside, the air felt different, thick with anticipation. Time seemed to slow as Jonah's figure filled the doorway, his presence powerful and calm, like a storm that had already passed. Eli didn't move. His heart beat louder than the howling wind outside, each pulse a reminder that everything was about to change again. Jonah's gaze shifted to Calder, whose face had turned from smug certainty to a pale, wide-eyed panic. The air crackled with an energy neither could ignore. The villagers had gathered behind them now, drawn in by the unnatural pull of what was happening. What is this? Calder whispered, his voice barely more than a rasp. Jonah didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the room, not with anger, but with something deeper, a sadness that seemed to settle like dust in the air. He slowly stepped forward, his boots silent against the wooden floor. As he approached the altar, his gaze met Eli's. There was something in his eyes that made Eli feel as though all the questions he had been holding inside were suddenly laid bare. You've seen what happens when people forget, Jonah said quietly. When they forget the real reasons they asked for help. Not for themselves, but for others. They begin to want. They begin to crave. And they lose the very thing that made them worthy of help in the first place. Their hearts. Calder clenched his fists, a wild look in his eyes. You think you can come back here and fix this? You left us. You left. Jonah's expression softened. I never left. I only stopped answering the wrong questions. The tension in the room thickened. It felt as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Eli stepped forward, his voice trembling. What happened to the miracles? Why did they stop? Jonah turned toward him, a gentle smile crossing his face. The miracles were never about me. They were about you. They were about your willingness to open your hearts again. The hunger you felt wasn't just in your stomachs, it was in your souls. Eli's mind whirled. But what about Calder? Why is he doing this? Jonah's gaze shifted to Calder, who had begun pacing nervously, his hands wringing with anxiety. Calder doesn't understand the truth of what happened here. He thinks power comes from control, from the ability to give and take. But he doesn't realize that true power comes from humility, from listening, from giving without expecting anything in return. Calder's face contorted with anger. You're just some prophet with a pretty story. You can't save us. You didn't save me. Jonah didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady, his voice calm. I never promised salvation, Calder. I only promised the chance to change. And you had it. But you chose something else. You chose fear. The room went still. Calder's breath quickened as he took a step back, his eyes darting around the villagers who had gathered in the church. They, too, were watching, waiting, hoping for some kind of answer. What does that mean? Calder demanded. You left us. You gave us nothing. How are we supposed to fix this now? How do we fix all the wrongs we've done? Jonah paused, then stepped closer to Calder, his voice low but clear. You can't undo what's been done, Calder. But you can stop making it worse. The more you try to control people's desires, the more they lose themselves. You don't hold the power you think you do. You never did. Calder's face twisted in frustration, but there was something else now, something deeper. A flicker of doubt. His eyes flicked to the villagers who had begun to look uncomfortable, shifting uneasily at his words. For a moment, there was silence. Then Calder's expression shifted. He took another step back, his shoulders sagging slightly. His posture, once so rigid with certainty, now seemed more like a man who had been caught in a lie, unsure of where to go next. "You're wrong," Calder muttered under his breath. I was just trying to give people what they wanted. What they needed." Jonah's eyes softened. "The needs you saw were your own, Calder, not theirs. You didn't listen to the truth. You listened only to the hunger. And hunger, when it controls you, leaves you empty." Eli could feel the weight of Jonah's words, as if they weren't just for Calder, but for everyone in the room. For himself. For the village. The truth was beginning to sink in. People didn't need more power. They didn't need riches or revenge or fear. They needed compassion. They needed to care for each other. They needed to listen, to truly see each other, not just for what they could take, but for what they could give. Eli looked up at Jonah, his heart heavy with understanding. "I've learned so much from you," he said softly. "But I still don't understand. Why did you answer my letter? Why me?" Jonah smiled, a soft, almost wistful expression. "Because you asked for hope, Eli. You didn't ask for a miracle. You didn't ask for a quick fix. You simply wanted to believe again. And that is what changed everything." For a long moment, there was no sound in the room except for the crackling of the fire. Then, one by one, the villagers began to step forward. They came slowly, hesitantly, as if afraid of making the wrong choice again. But Jonah was no longer a figure of mystery. He was a reminder. A reminder that they could change, but only if they were willing to see the truth. They didn't need to ask for things. They didn't need to take. They needed to give. Calder stood at the edge of the room, his shoulders slumped. The words Jonah had spoken weighed heavily on him, the truth of them cutting deeper than any threat. And for the first time, he realized that the power he had sought, control over others, was nothing but an illusion. Jonah looked back at him one last time. "You have a choice, Calder. You always did. It's not too late to make the right one." Calder didn't speak. He simply nodded, the weight of his mistakes settling upon him like an unshakable burden. Jonah turned to the villagers, his voice strong once more. "There's no more need for fear. No more need for empty promises. The real miracles come when we choose to live with open hearts, when we choose to listen, when we choose to care." And with that, Jonah turned toward the door. The villagers watched him go, his silhouette fading into the snowstorm outside. Eli stood still, his heart full of something more than just hope. He stood at the crossroads of a new beginning. As Jonah disappeared into the falling snow, the village of Raven Hollow began to heal in ways that were deeper than mere survival. They had learned something precious, that the real miracles are not about the gifts we receive, but the love we give. And from that day forward, Raven Hollow never again asked for miracles. Instead, they simply asked to listen, and, in listening, they found the greatest gift of all. The gift of each other. Spring had come, and with it, the world seemed to breathe again. The snow, once a thick blanket smothering the life out of the land, had melted away. The trees were beginning to bud, and the once dry fields were lush with green. Raven Hollow, like the rest of the world, was coming back to life. But it wasn't just the earth that had been renewed. The village had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The church, now empty of false promises, stood at the heart of Raven Hollow as a symbol not of desperation, but of hope. It had been cleaned, painted, and turned into a community center. No longer was it a place of unanswered prayers. Instead, it had become a space for the villagers to gather, share meals, discuss their hopes, and work together. The donations that once filled the church had been repurposed, not into the hands of one person or a select few, but into the hands of the community. The food, the clothes, the tools, all of it was shared freely. A system of true charity had been built, born from the ashes of their collective hunger. Eli stood at the edge of the village, looking out over the fields. He had changed, just like the village. His eyes were no longer full of the same quiet despair they had once held. Instead, there was a fire in them, a fire fueled by something stronger than hunger or fear. Hope. He had become the village's new storyteller, the one who carried the lessons of Jonah forward. Every week, he would gather the children under the great oak tree by the river and tell them stories of kindness, of sacrifice, and of miracles, not the kind that come in the form of riches or fame, but the ones born from hearts full of compassion. He no longer sought answers in the form of requests. His questions were now about what could be given, what could be shared. And yet, there were whispers. Whispers that Jonah had not truly left. That somewhere in the woods, on the edge of the village, he still watched over them, a quiet guardian, a reminder that the miracle they had experienced was not a one-time event but a way of life. Some believed it was Jonah's spirit that had touched the village. Others thought the true miracle was the strength they had found in themselves once they stopped asking for things they didn't need. Jonah had given them one final lesson. The greatest miracles come not from divine intervention, but from the power we hold within ourselves to change. Calder had stayed. In the weeks following Jonah's departure, Calder had remained in Raven Hollow, though he was no longer the man who once craved power. The realization of his mistakes had weighed heavily on him, but he did not run. Instead, he stayed to work alongside the villagers, to rebuild what he had tried to destroy. He started helping with the harvest, offering his knowledge of the land. Though the villagers were slow to forgive him, they could see the sincerity in his actions. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Instead, he earned it, piece by piece, day by day. Calder became an example, proof that even those who had lost their way could find their path again. But the true heart of Raven Hollow's transformation wasn't in the harvest or the community center. It wasn't in the shared meals or the repaired homes. It was in the quiet moments when the villagers would sit together, eyes bright with understanding, hearts full of warmth. They had learned something invaluable, the difference between surviving and living. Before Jonah had arrived, before the letter was written, Raven Hollow had been a place of mere existence. People had only looked after themselves, driven by their individual fears and desires. But now, they had become a family, a village that no longer lived for itself but for one another. And Eli? Eli had become the heart of that family. One crisp evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eli found himself standing outside the church, just like Jonah had done all those weeks ago. The same breeze that had once carried the chill of fear now felt warm with promise. He held in his hands a letter. It wasn't to God this time. It was a letter to himself. The letter he wrote was simple, full of gratitude and reflection. He spoke of the lessons he had learned, of the strength he had found, and of the people who had become his family. And as he stood there, looking out over the village he had helped to rebuild, he realized something important. This was the miracle. Not the food that had come when they needed it most, not the return of Jonah, not even the gifts they had received, but the fact that they had become the miracle for each other. The true miracle had always been within them. Eli tucked the letter into the old donation box at the church, the same box where Jonah's letter had once Saturday. He smiled, knowing it was time to let go. The world would continue to spin, the seasons would come and go. But Raven Hollow had found its heart, and with it, its purpose. And no matter what happened next, Eli knew one thing for sure. Hope was never really lost. It had always been right there, in the hearts of the people who dared to ask for it. As the last rays of sunlight dipped behind the hills, Eli turned and walked back toward the village. The sounds of life filled the air, the laughter of children, the hum of conversation, the clink of dishes being washed. And as he walked, he couldn't help but feel that the story wasn't over. It had only just begun. For as long as they remembered Jonah's lesson, the one about giving, not asking, the village would continue to thrive. And somewhere in the distance, the wind whispered a name that would forever be remembered: Jonah. The story of Jonah and the miracle in Raven Hollow had come full circle. What started as a village teetering on the edge of despair had transformed into one full of hope, compassion, and selflessness. Through one simple letter, the villagers learned that true power doesn't come from receiving miracles, but from living with open hearts and helping others. And while Jonah had left, his spirit lived on in the hearts of the villagers, reminding them that the greatest miracles are